In the last of this series on demand and supply side policies, we're going to focus on the supply side policies. And in essence, what this is increasing the potential output of an economy. This is where the LAS curve will shift to the right, and also we'll see that the SAS curve will shift to the right. The natural rate of unemployment will decrease, and we could also see this by a PPF shifting outwards. And in all of these instances, this is resulting in economic growth, where the potential output of the economy has increased. So supply side policies, the objectives. So as mentioned, the supply side policies aim to shift the LAS curve to the right in order to achieve now long-term economic growth. So I'd just like to compare and contrast this to the demand side policies, which you've been looking at. The demand side policies aim to shift aggregate demand to the left or to the right, and they aim to smooth out the economic fluctuations, those peaks and troughs of the business cycle. Whereas now, with the supply side policy, we are aiming to focus on achieving this long-term economic growth. And there's two types of supply side policies. There's one that's market-oriented. This is favored by the neoclassical economists, and interventionist, favored by the Keynesians. The Keynesians, in essence, are in favor of government involvement to solve the problems in the economy, and the neoclassical economists believe more in sort of hands-off, and that the economy is best to fix any problems more or less on its own. Okay, so as I hinted at before, these supply-side policies do not attempt to stabilize the economy. In other words, to reduce the severity of the business cycle. That's where the demand-side policies come into place. So the supply-side policies, these legislative, regulatory, and institutional changes in the economy aim to, 1, increase production efficiency, 2, decrease the natural rate of unemployment, because if you have the LAS curve shifting to the right, then you know that the natural rate of unemployment is going to go down because you'll be producing more, and to increase the economy's production possibilities. Market-oriented supply-side policies really originated back in the early 80s. We had Margaret Thatcher, who you see on top, and Ronald Reagan below. And the two of them felt that the growth in the real GDP depends on the supply side of the economy rather than the demand side. Now, what had happened prior to Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan is that we had very sort of a Keynesian approach. A lot of government spending prior to the early 1980s. Governments were having very large budget deficits. The debts were increasing. We had a problem with inflation spiraling upwards. And so it was felt at a certain point we've really got to move away from these demand side policies and start focusing on the supply side of the economy. And in fact, this type of viewpoint was actually known as Reaganomics. So what is the theoretical expected outcome of increasing LAS and the SAS curve? Well, we'll call this Y1. So if we have them shifting to the right, we'll have LAS2. And if LAS curve shifts, then the SAS curve will also shift. We'll have a larger output. So what happens to growth? It increases. Price stability. We do have price stability. It might not be exactly the same price, but the prices won't be fluctuating wildly. And employment goes up because we are now producing more than we were before. So the natural rate of unemployment has in fact gone down. As long as the economy can move from one long-run equilibrium to another, so from one position on one LAS curve to another, we can say that there'll be no recessionary gaps and no unemployment. Economic policy should focus on increasing aggregate supply, shifting both the LAS and SAS curves, so this will at least match any increase in aggregate demand. Furthermore, increases in aggregate supply may address the problem of stagflation. So let's see how that would be. So if we had aggregate demand, have the short run aggregate supply. If we had stagflation, we know we've gone from point A to point B. We'll call this SAS2. And we have a problem where inflation were to increase. Now, if we used a demand side policy and from point B were to then shift aggregate demand to the right, we would solve the problem of unemployment, but inflation would go from A to B to even a higher position, C, which I haven't drawn here. But if we instead address this with a supply side approach and get aggregate supply to shift back to the right, and our C is back down here, then we've addressed the problem of unemployment because we're producing more, and we've addressed the problem of inflation because the price level has gone back more or less to where it started with. So let's focus first on market-oriented supply-side policies. So this is where the market is going to basically correct the problem, but we're going to help and nudge it along by doing certain things. So one, if we reduce the size of the government sector, we're going to thereby increase competition. It's often felt that the government is not particularly good at running businesses. They're not efficient, they don't have the profit incentive, they don't have the incentive to reduce inefficiencies and so on. So if we could reduce the government sector, this would be certainly a supply side policy to increase LAS and SAS. We could have improved incentives for greater private initiative by lowering taxes. So if taxes are lower, businesses will have more incentive to expand. 3, make the labor market more competitive and more responsive to supply and demand. And we'll look at this in more depth in a slide or two. And we could also liberalize or reduce barriers to international trade and capital flows. We'll be looking at more of that in grade 12 or IB2 when we look at international economics. So in other words, let's let those markets really flourish. Let's have the competition go and the markets go. So reducing the size of government sector, we looked at that in increasing competition. A large government sector may be inefficient because it can involve bureaucratic procedures, a lot of bureaucracy, and high administrative cost. And you can come across unproductive workers. And the unproductive workers, sometimes it's because they're heavily unionized, their jobs are very well protected, they can't be easily fired. So since governments do not face incentives to maximize profits, they might not be as concerned as the private sector about lowering their costs. So methods to reduce the government sector. So how could we achieve this? Well, we can what's called privatizing government enterprises. So in other words, sell off things like hydro or water utilities, the postal delivery and so on, garbage pickup. So have it become in private hands rather than run by the government. We could have private funding of public sector projects. The next slide will show an example of that. We could contract out to the private sector, and we've done this in Toronto, which we'll see in a minute. We could have deregulation, where there's less regulation, restricting sort of the movement of firms and what they can and cannot do, and restricting monopoly power, so we don't have really, really powerful monopolies existing who are reducing the quantity and driving up prices. So here's one example from a while ago. It was asking, should Toronto follow the UK's privatization example, looking at our transit? So that's one possibility. This is another news clip from a while ago where our city has outsourced garbage collection. So west of Yonge is now done by a private firm. East of Yonge is not, but there is talk about privatizing or outsourcing garbage collection east of Yonge, but it hasn't happened yet. So reducing the size of government sector, what might be the strengths and weaknesses? In the case of privatization, disadvantages can arise in the event that a public monopoly, simply becomes a private monopoly. Products or services may become less affordable, and this may have particularly damaging consequences for lower income groups, especially if it concerns necessities. Now, if you're able to watch this brief uh, video clip. It comes from a movie called The Corporation, and it's the case study of where Bolivia actually privatized water, and it created an awful lot of problems because it drove the price up so high that a lot of the poor people, a lot of the low-income people, had trouble managing to pay for necessities such as water and healthcare, or water and education. In the case of deregulation, we had a big problem in the autumn of 2008, where we had the huge financial collapse and huge firms going out of business, and the government propping up banks saying they were too big to fail. And one of the problems of how this had all come about is that the industry had been deregulated to a point where it became much riskier in terms of it doing business. Improving incentives by lowering taxes. So if we look at lowering personal income taxes, supply-side economists say that if you cut personal income taxes, people are going to have more incentive to work more. So the AS curve and the LAS curve will shift to the right because there'll be more people working. On the other hand, other economists might argue if you lower personal income taxes, there may be some people out there that actually work less because they can keep more money in their pocket, and maybe they prefer to have more leisure time. But overall, I think it's agreed that more people would be more apt to work harder or to work longer. You could lower taxes on investment income, and so then people would be more motivated to save. And we need to realize that savings become the money that then becomes available for investment. So more savings leads to more investment, which is more capital, which is increasing the potential output. You could lower business taxes, so you're increasing profits and therefore investment spending. So you have new and improved capital goods, technological innovations, and more research and development, which would certainly shift the LAS and SAS curve to the right. Lowering taxes' strengths and weaknesses. It is felt that tax cuts may give rise to larger impacts on aggregate demand than on aggregate supply, thereby frustrating some of the intended supply-side impacts. So, to expand on this a bit, if the tax cuts mean that people and firms are going to spend more, which is part of aggregate demand, if it shifts more than the aggregate supply shifting, both of these to the right, then you may be triggering higher inflation. And we looked at this. Could income tax cuts ever lead to people working less? We discussed that in the last slide. And why might tax cuts lead to more inflation? Well, that's what I was saying above. If you're shifting AD to the right more than AS, your price level will increase. Other strengths and weaknesses. Tax cuts may worsen income distribution. It's the wealthy that pay the most taxes, and they earn most of the interest income and business profits. So tax cuts may benefit them the most and leave the poorer income people, the lower income people, not benefiting as much. And of course, if you're doing tax cuts, it could increase the budget deficit unless you're accompanying this with decreases in government spending. So it's often said that the rich have so many tax loopholes and they don't pay their fair share of taxes. Well, this comes from, it's a little dated, but in 2005, National Post states that the top 5% of income earners pay 39% of taxes, so almost 40% of the taxes. And here, this relates to the other slide. This was at a case out in New Brunswick. A few slides ago, we talked about tax cuts could impact the higher income people more. And here it says the high income earners will be the big winners from tax reform. Our government was proposing to split income between married people that had a child who was 18 or younger. And so this shows you on one example, instead of taxes from one person being 60,000, excuse me, I do believe this is the taxes collected, and 12,000 from the spouse, if they were allowed to combine their incomes and then pay the taxes, this would be the scenario. And instead of collecting 8,500 in taxes, it would be closer to 75 with federal income tax splitting. So this was one thing that was proposed. So making the labor market more responsive to supply and demand. This is going to sound fairly draconian, but it's making the market more flexible. And you may see an IB question that's asking, how can you make labor more responsive or greater market flexibility? Well, one, you could abolish minimum wage legislation. So the forces of demand and supply would be more responsive to the situation of wages. You could weaken the power of labor or trade unions. So this would prevent wages from artificially being driven up too high, and again, letting the forces of supply and demand determine what the wages should be. You could reduce unemployment benefits, so people can't be out of work for a very long period of time, so they'd be more apt to accept just about any, not any job that came along, but they would be less picky about what jobs they would accept because they wouldn't have the security blanket of the unemployment benefits. Again, making the market more responsive to supply and demand. And the last one sounds horrible, but reducing job security. So if it's easier to fire individuals, then firms will be more apt to hire. Now there's a video clip, I'm not sure if you can see it, but it's on French labor rights. And in essence, it's pointing out that for long-term employees, it's very, very difficult in France to fire them. And they are instituting, or they were trying to institute, a case where the young workers, so workers who had been at the firm for a year or two, had much fewer labor rights and were much easier to fire. Making the labor market more responsive, some of the strengths and weaknesses. So if wages can fall when there's unemployment, this will reduce firms' costs of production and give rise to increased profits, as well as increased employment and profits. So if wages can fall when there's unemployment and reduce the firm's costs, then they'll be more apt to hire, knowing that wages will be flexible if they come across an economic downturn. Some economists argue that paying workers a higher than equilibrium rate encourages them to work harder, increasing their productivity. Increased labor productivity causes firms to increase their demand for labor, so they're on the flip side. Reducing protection results in lower incomes for some workers, certainly, an increased drop in security, and contributes to increasing income inequalities. And also, unemployment benefits can play an important role in a recession. As firms cut back on output and unemployment increases, unemployed workers suffer a loss of income, which puts a downward pressure on consuming spending. And if consumer spending decreases, AD increases, and the economy slows down even more. So we had back in the financial crisis after 2008, we had Canada's Economic Action Plan. We actually still have that. But what happened here is that they provided an extra 5 weeks of employment benefits. The reason they did this is that there were so many people losing their jobs, and it was becoming so scary in terms of possibly losing their house if they couldn't make the payments, the difficulties for families, and so on. And they recognized that the economy really was in a down spin, and that people needed additional support at this time. So liberalizing or freeing up international trade and capital flows, again to be studied more in IB2. There has been a tendency for freer trade and freer capital movements between countries, from the reduction in trade barriers and exchange control. So trade barriers can be things like tariffs, which are taxes on imports, quotas, which are a legal limit to how much you can import of a certain good, and so on. So on the grounds that both of these increase global competition and therefore improve the allocation of resources within countries and globally. So I'm going to leave these testers to you to see if You can answer them, and again, the answers are posted on Blackboard. So now we're going to move away from market-based to interventionist supply-side policies. And I sometimes describe this as the government getting their hands dirty. In other words, they've got like more of an active role in influencing the economy. So interventionist supply-side policies presuppose that the free market economy cannot by itself achieve the desired results in terms of increasing potential output, and argue that what is required for this purpose is government intervention in specific areas, including the following. So it probably sounds very much like Keynesian sort of approach, which it is. So 1, training and education. We know that these programs can provide skills to workers and specializations for which there is a high demand. Improved healthcare services and access. Healthier workers will be more productive. And research and development, which is the fundamental activity behind technological advances, which are an important contributor to economic growth. Many governments are heavily involved in R&D. Governments also provide incentives to private sector firms to engage in research and development activities, and these usually take the form of tax incentives as well as patent protection. Other interventionist supply-side policies. There can be provision of job information. The next slide will go into that more in depth. There could be support for small and medium-sized firms. So small businesses may be given tax exemptions, grants, low-interest loans, and business guidance. I know when I was in business, for the first $200,000 of income, we were taxed at of profit, we were taxed at a very low rate, and then only after that did they kick in at a higher rate. So they were trying to support small and medium firms through these tax exemptions. Support for infant industries. These are thought to be emerging industries in developing countries, which sometimes receive government support in forms of grants, subsidies, tax exemptions, and tariffs or other forms of protection against imports, not exports. And again, we'll look at this more in IB 2, excuse me. So infant industries, basically what's happening is that the government has decided they want to really support a particular industry. Let's say it's the car industry. So they'll throw up high tariffs, which are high taxes on imported cars. They may set quotas of how many cars can come into their country. They want the domestic industry to be able to get on its feet, to become competitive. And then once it's emerged, it will tend to then lower these trade barriers and let these firms then compete on a global market. But in essence, what they're doing is supporting the infant stage of getting this type of industry on its feet. So here's one thing that we do in Canada called Service Canada. We've got one of these around the corner, up Yonge Street, and make a left onto St. Clair Avenue East, and you'll see a Service Canada. What may be of interest for you is the fact that students can search the Student Job Bank to find opportunities, but there are certainly other types of services that they offer as well. But it's trying to make it easier for people to connect with jobs. Other interventionist supply-side policies can be improvements in infrastructure. So infrastructure is a type of physical capital and includes power, telecommunications, roads, dams, urban transport, ports, and airports. Infrastructure increases efficiencies in production as it lowers costs, and it enables economic activities to be carried out more efficiently. So you can think of if a country doesn't have a good network of telecommunications, of roads, of airports, and so on, it's much more difficult to bring your goods to market. The better the infrastructure, the easier it is for businesses to conduct business. So these interventionist policies can collectively be called industrial policies, which are policies designed to support the growth of the industrial sector of an economy, and in so doing shifts the LAS curve to the right. Industrial policies allow the government to support particular industries that are believed to offer the greatest possibilities for growth in the future. And let me emphasize that they really do tend to zero in on the industries that the government does feel have the greatest potential. If they feel that it's an industry that's dying out, the industry will not receive the government support, or at least not to the extent that other industries will. So here's one example of Industry Canada coming to the University of Waterloo, which is of course high tech. And the Harper government celebrates economic action in Canada's knowledge economy, so greatly IT. So that's where they're putting their money because that's where they feel the future growth is. On the downside, it's argued that government interference in the market may lead to inefficiencies and resource misallocation. Again, is the government going to pick the best area to allocate the resources, and will it be done in an efficient manner? In addition, government tax revenues might have better alternative uses elsewhere. Interventionist policies may require substantial use of tax revenue. So again, a tester for you to look at and compare your answer. We saw that demand-side policies not only have demand-side, but also sometimes supply-side effects. So for an example, an increase in government spending on infrastructure, R&D, or health and education certainly increases aggregate demand because we have government spending, the G component of aggregate demand. But it also works to increase potential output, a supply-side effect. So the LAS curve will shift to the right and the SAS curve. Similarly, supply-side policies have not only supply-side, but often demand-side effects. So for example, we know that lower income taxes might improve incentives to work harder and longer, but it also increases consumption spending, a demand-side effect and a component of AD. Economists generally agree that supply-side policies play a very important role in increasing potential output. But they will disagree on whether market-oriented or interventionist policies are more effective, and the importance of supply-side effects of demand-side policies in causing growth. Thank you.